Kia ora tātou, ko Manu Papuni-Isles tēnei. I'm a part of the Taura project. Following the recloaking events, recloaking the whenua events, we plan to run a series of webinars. Now these webinars will be looking at ahead of the window for submissions closing on the government's proposal to the exotic species from Permanent Carbon Forest Category under the ETS. We have our uncle Hilton Collier here to give his kōrero and perspective on the kaupapa. Kia ora, uncle.
Kia ora, Manu. Ko Hukurangi te manga, ko Waiapu te awa, ko Ngāti Parau te iwi, ko Hilton Collier hau, General Manager of Pākehiro Farms. It's an interesting topic when we think about some of the proposals looking at how the ETS should be modified to exclude indigenous trees and to exclude exotic trees in favour of indigenous species. And a couple of points to make. The first point is, I think it's always dangerous when we consider these sorts of proposals in isolation as a part or element of the taiao, rather than thinking about the taiao in its entirety. We also need to think about the people in our communities who will be impacted by some of these decisions that are being made that are essentially a response to short-term policy imperatives. And by that I mean, if we look at the history of the coast, we had Pākehā arrive here on the East Coast. They cleared the indigenous tree cover. They started farming sheep and cattle, created these monocultural pastoral systems, created an erosion problem. We then saw a response to the erosion problem, which was the planting of pine trees. And in recent years, we've had a lot of afforestation, a lot of pine plantations established on the East Coast as we transitioned land use in response to an erosion problem. We're now seeing another type of policy imperative around greenhouse gases, where there's this huge debate about how do we deal and mitigate climate change. Yeah, and while I think climate change is certainly a problem we need to deal with and manage, we have to make sure we don't create a whole lot of undesirable, perverse outcomes that impact on not only the well-being of our environment, our waterways, our lands, but also the impacts on our people. So certainly I'm in favour of some of the proposals that are being consulted on at the moment, but I think we need to spend more time thinking about the future state for our region, what our landscape needs to look like in 100, 150 years, and how do we transition that landscape to ensure we deal with all the environmental challenges before us. That includes climate change, that includes biodiversity and fresh water. It also needs to allow time for our people, our whānau, our hapu to transition into that new future space. A lot of the proposals I'm seeing seem to be almost knee-jerk reactions. And yeah, if I think back over the last 50 years about the impacts on our region, you know, in 2019, I think it was, we saw the Tolaga Bay floods and the damage caused when Forestry decimated Tolaga Bay. As a farmer, I also need to acknowledge and recognise the damage that clearing a lot of our hill country as indiscriminately as we did has created a lot of erosion, water quality problems that we're dealing with. We've also created a different monocultural system with our farm practices. So I think that's actually the bigger issue, rather than do we include or exclude exotic trees. If we believe in some of these things, it may be in our interest in the short term to allow exotic trees, but have a requirement that over time, these need to be transitioned into indigenous tree species. I think we also need to think about where those forests are established. If we were to plant a lot of the flatland you see behind me in permanent carbon sink species, Is that a good outcome for us and our people? You know, what are we going to live on? Where are we going to get our money from as we start to transition? So I think that's actually the much bigger debate, Manu. We need to think about where we develop permanent carbon sinks, why we develop them, and how will they impact on our people, and how do we transition to that future state?
Thank you for that, Uncle. Do you think this is an issue all Māori landowners in Tairāwhiti should be paying attention to and involved with?
I think it's an issue for all landowners, but especially for Māori landowners. You know, one of the things about Ngāti Porou, we continue to live and occupy our traditional lands. We have been here for something like 37 or 38 generations, and given our cultural imperatives, I think we'll be here for a long time yet. So we need to be clear that this is about us setting the policies for the future, actively participating, making sure views are articulated through the submission process to ensure we don't become a people where once again we have government policies imposed on us. Let's try and embrace the opportunity, participate in the submissions, and shape and influence those policies. So I think we all need to take an active interest. We also need to recognise the diversity of our ownership structures. In some cases, we are owner-operators in our own right. In other instances, we have farms that have governance structures, and those governance structures need to engage on behalf of all the whānau who ultimately are owners in those blocks of land.
What do you see as the potential financial risk and benefits in the government proposal in terms of the likely impacts on afforestation on the East Coast?
I guess it depends on how you measure financial risk. I tend to look at it as what's good for the land and the communities first, and how do we make sure that any transition spreads the benefits or the burden of those transitions in a much more equitable way. If I think about the sort of economic development we've seen since the European arrived in New Zealand, it is very much about using what is essentially communally owned assets, i.e. the taiao, our waterways, our soils, and those sorts of things for private individual benefit. So it's been a form of economic development that is in many ways exploitative, and provided you had the estate and fee title or the right to call that land I owned, you've been able to, within reason, do what you like with that land. I think for the future, we need a different type of model where the true cost of our land use activities is measured. So just because I want to plant a particular type of tree on my land, I should think about how does that affect my neighbours? How does it affect people downstream from me? What's the contribution to the well-being of both the taiao and our communities? Because we all live in these complicated ecosystems. We don't live in isolation. So I think we actually need a different type of model, not the one that we've used for the last 150 years. It may have got us to where we are today. It doesn't need to be the future model we use to create a better well-being outcome for everyone.
Do you think our land block committees understand the significance of this policy?
That's a toughie. I think there will be various degrees of understanding and knowledge about a lot of these policies. I've recently been involved with He Waka Eke No, which is agriculture entering the greenhouse gases, and even people who have been intimately involved with the development of that policy over the last 2 years struggle to understand in simple terms what these policies mean at a grassroots level. You know, often the language is very technical, it's very bureaucratic. They make these big attempts to be apolitical, but when you distill it down to the grassroots level, which is what would it mean on my land tomorrow type stuff, it's very hard to understand that unless you understand whenua Māori. So, I think there will be varying degrees of knowledge and understanding, but that reflects the complexity of some of these proposals. So often when I look at these models, I think about, so how will that impact on the PFL group as one example? How does that impact on the blocks that either I or my whānau whakapapatū have shares in? And therefore, how do we describe those impacts to them? And I think it's not till you get down to that type of interpretation that people see the effects for them.
Will different land blocks likely stand to be better off or worse off depending on their current land use?
Well, I think it comes back to how you measure those benefits and costs. I think if you have a block with a lot of eroding hill country, it could be a way to deal with erosion and for the land to provide for future generations. But we also need to recognise there are some significant costs involved in planting those tree species. So certainly I think some of them could be better off, some of them could be worse off, but that's only because of the way we measure costs and benefits. When we cleared the land, I'm sure our tipuna thought they would be much better off because the Pākehā brought a type of pastoral farming system with them. It's just many years later we found it created an erosion problem. So when we measure, are we better off or worse off by the proposals, we need to reflect it's only because we haven't fully costed some of the downstream impacts. That tends to be why I say, look at the impacts on the taiao. Will it enhance the well-being of the taiao, or will it simply result in, I can't see my rubbish falling into the river, it's not my problem then?
Bye-bye. Uncle, I have questions in front of me, but I think you have a better idea of what you think you should have a kōrero about. Is there any more kōrero you would like to whakakapi our kōrero session?
I think the biggest challenge we have before us is deciding what that 100-year vision looks like for us here in Ngāti Porou. If you look at the background behind me, it's a mixed landscape. You'll see big slips. You'll see reasonably easy hill country covered in scrub. You'll see some of the Waiapu River where the banks are exposed and not planted. When I talk about the costs and the benefits, because we haven't dealt with a lot of the adverse impacts of the way we've used lands over the last couple of 100 years, we end up with a situation where the taiao continues to degrade. We have a Waiapu River that has very big floods. We have sedimentation filling up a lot of our kapatakai along the coastline. So rebalancing a lot of those things, I think, are the big strategic issues we need to deal with. Unfortunately, we're having to deal with it with the imposition of a colonial model of land tenure. So unfortunately, it means if the land behind me doesn't belong to me, it's not my problem. When the reality is the detrimental things that have been done to our environment have impacted on us as a people and will continue to impact on us until it's clear what we all need to do collectively to address those imbalances in the taiao. And if that means planting trees, earning carbon credits, earning credits for biodiversity, or perhaps investing some money to plant exotic trees to address erosion as a short-term fix, then I think that's simply part of the journey to healing our people. And in all things we do, we need to balance the needs of the taiao with the needs of our people. We can't disconnect the way we have tended to disconnect them in recent years.
Ngā mihi, tēnā koe Uncle Hilton, o kōrero e pāna ki tō tātou nei taiao o tira tō tātou nei oranga o Ngāti Porou. Ka nui ngā mihi kia koe, uncle.